Now, the muscle length, this is a graphical representation of that the more you stretch something, the more you stretch the rubber band, the more ding, tension it has. Man, you could have gotten anything you wanted to learn about cardiology out of a Roadrunner movie, huh? More you stretch it and ding, passive tension. So it says if you don't stretch it at all, there's no passive tension. It's like a floppy rubber band. You stretch it a little. You stretch it a lot. Now it also says that when you get your rubber band all the way to the end, no matter how much you stretch it, you can't go further. When you stretch the rubber band, it creates elastic recoil, passive recoil. And that's the problem in the heart. That's the issue. The more you preload, the more passive tension you have. Now, that's not infinite. In other words, just like trying to reach for someone who's pulling. You see, if I lift weights from this position, I can lift a much heavier weight than if I get my arms all super hyperextended back here. I can't, too much. Now, if I have it very super enclosed like this, I can't lift very much because it's too close. If I have it out here, this is where I could do the maximum. If I get my arms extended behind my back, I can't pull as much because it's overextended. So it is with preload. No passive tension, well, I'm not going to have any elastic recoil. I put a little bit of a weight on the muscle. I stretch it a little bit. Well, I'm going to have a little passive recoil. I put more weight on there, preload. I pull it, well, the passive tension, listen, passive tension rubber band. I stretch the rubber band, it wants to stretch back. But remember the actin and myosin filaments? Ready? Here is the Z line. When you have your actin and myosin filaments, here's the actin filaments, the thin filaments, and you have your myosin filaments, and you have them super close to each other like that. You can't have them move towards each other and contract too much because they're already too close. They're already too close. In your most frail gesture are things which enclose me, but which I cannot touch because they are too near. In your most frail gesture are things which enclose me, but what I cannot touch because they are too near. That's talking about not enough preload. So when you have them separated more, then you have a very nice thing here where you have them separated enough to make some interesting tension, but not so much that it overstretches. See, when you overstretch a muscle, and you have the actin and myosin overlapping just by the tippy-tippies. You see, in this last one here, in choice C, when you have this last one here, when you have it overstretching and they're just touching by their tippy-tippies, well, it's like trying to hold it on by their fingertips. In this last one here, it's barely touching the actin and myosin. And it's like ratchets. You want it so that they're joined. But what if you're like so far apart, it's overstretched. And you lose force. Like trying to reach off the top of a cliff to pull somebody up. It's too far. And that's the basis of this next slide. When you stretch the muscle, in the middle, you have your optimum length. In the middle, you have your optimum length. The actin and myosin filaments have a certain amount of overlap. And your actin and myosin filaments have a certain amount of overlap here. Now, when you overstretch them, what ends up happening when you overstretch them is that they start to lose contact with each other. What we have here is as the muscle lengthens, you are increasing the amount of passive tension, just like pulling the rubber band. However, as the actin and myosin filaments separate and they don't touch enough, just like you overextending yourself to reach someone off the side of the cliff, if you don't have enough contact, you can't exert the force. The same way I can't lift myself up by my finger tippy tips. I might be able to do it by reaching in my whole hands. That's why that in human beings, in life, once you get past a certain level of stretch, the amount of force you can exert diminishes. Just like I can't lift you up just by the tips of my fingernails. We have to have more contact. The same way I can't pull weights if they're all the way back here. I have to get it here, and then I can pull more. This concept is the concept of preload. You stretch the heart open, there's passive tension. When it goes too much, you lose force. This is the very intrinsic concept to dilated cardiomyopathy. When the heart dilates too much, you start to overstretch the actin and myosin filaments. And what ends up happening is that the actin and myosin filaments can't touch. And if they can't touch, you can't generate any force of contraction. And then you get a low ejection fraction. This is the very concept of dilated cardiomyopathy. This is the very intrinsic concept of dilated cardiomyopathy. When it dilates up too much, you lose a force of contraction. Let us keep our eye on the ball. And the ball is, we can talk about all these other diseases like tuberculosis and AIDS and depression and suicide and motor vehicle accidents, multiple sclerosis, myasthenia gravis, and 100 other diseases. But you know what? If you add up all of them together and multiply them by 5, there's not as much death as there is from simple old myocardial infarction and congestive failure. And that's because we are herbivores masquerading as omnivores. Never meant to eat that meat. We're all going to die. Let's have a bacon cheeseburger. Oh, eat. Actin myosin filaments stretch. And then they can't cause a force of contraction. Then you need to exercise, and you get no blood moving. When you stretch the heart to a certain level, it's good. But when you get to another past it, the tension decreases because it can't generate the force. Now, let's look at this issue about length and tension. Let's try and get this into the most rudimentary thing you know from common sense. When you stretch something, it pulls back. When you stretch something, it pulls back. When you stretch a rubber band, it pulls back. When you stretch a rope, it pulls back. When you stretch the heart, it pushes back. It means that when you take the passive tension and you say, well, is no stretch, it means that all you can do is have straight contractility. You have no stretch, straight contractility. Now, don't worry about this thing about infinite afterload. Doesn't make that much of an issue here. It basically is saying that when you get to a little bit more of a stretch, you're adding not only the passive stretch, you're adding an increase in the ability to contract. The center panel says when you have more passive tension, you're not just adding the passive tension of the weight. You're also adding the fact that muscles don't contract maximally when they're like this or like this. Muscles contract maximally when they're moderately stretched. Stretched too much, you lose force. Not stretched enough, you can't pull much weights there. Muscles contract the best when they're moderately stretched. And so a bunch of the actin and myosin filaments are overlapping, but not too many. And that's what the center panel is. The panel on the right says when you really stretch the muscle a lot, you may be getting more passive tension, but you're overstretching the muscle and you're losing the active. The active is when the actin myosin filaments are contracting. Actin myosin filaments are contracting. Actin myosin filaments are contracting. Passive is you're pulling the muscles apart. Active is when they are splitting ATP and pulling. This slide here says the more you stretch a muscle, the more you have passive tension. This slide here is that the more you stretch the muscle, you're having passive tension. But when you go past a certain point, you start to lose the ability to contract because you're overstretching it. This is the very basis right here of dilated cardiomyopathy. Dilated cardiomyopathy is overstretching. No stretch, you're not going to have much force. A modest stretch, excellent force, passive and dynamic. Too much stretch, you lose the ability to contract.